Welcome to New Jersey Politics with Laura Jones. I am Laura Jones, and we are so glad to have you here. Today, we are going to discuss how underage victims of domestic and sexual violence are getting caught in the system. Many of these young victims are being prosecuted and serving jail time. Yasmin Vafa heads Rights for Girls and is standing by to discuss what is being done to help. First, though, the state is working on a $10 billion project to widen parts of an 8-mile stretch of the New Jersey Turnpike in North Jersey, potentially bringing more traffic and pollution to the area. The Turnpike Authority insists that the project will not lead to significant environmental harm, but that is not sitting well with some elected officials, including our first guest, Jersey City Mayor Stephen Fulop. Mayor, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you here.
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, you recently joined a protest against the Turnpike expansion. So can you tell me a little bit about what motivated you to take such a public stand on the issue?
Look, I think for viewers to understand really all about the history here and what we're advocating for, first of all, it's more than an $11 billion project. And initially, what they outlined was that it would solve some traffic issues. But what we've conveyed, and the mayor of Hoboken has conveyed, that the bottleneck is really at the Holland Tunnel. So this would expand the turnpike without solving any of the problems, while also increasing pollution, environmental impact. $11 billion could go a long way to solving every single mass transit issue that New Jersey faces, and it's better use of money.
Right, so that kind of leads me to my next question. As you mentioned, the Turnpike is already saying it's estimated to be $10.7 billion, close to $11 billion. So in your view, how could that money be better spent to improve transportation in New Jersey?
Look, I think anybody who's watching this can attest to the fact that New Jersey Transit is in shambles, that the governor has not fixed it, whether it's new infrastructure like the light rail expansion in South Jersey or the Bergen expansion of the Hudson-Bergen light rail. We're fixing the buses or making the stations more reliable. You're basically talking about an $11 billion investment of the turnpike that won't solve traffic while at the same time allowing New Jersey Transit to deteriorate. So, $11 billion in capital could go a long way to impacting the quality of life of every single resident in New Jersey, and it's just better use of funds.
Yeah, and you've been very vocal about prioritizing light rail over road expansion. So how do you see that fitting into the bigger picture of New Jersey's transportation future?
Yeah, look, I think it's not only light rail. I think the reality is that we're a very congested state, very densely populated, not a lot of opportunities for additional roads, more and more people and more cars. The only way that you're going to really be able to move people around is investing in mass transit. And then over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you've just seen mass transit in New Jersey get worse and worse. Buses are dirty, unreliable, trains constantly breaking down with massive delays. Who would ever rely on New Jersey Transit unless you actually have to? And that shouldn't be the case. So $11 billion would solve it. And it's just a better use of funds. And that's what we're pushing for.
And a lot of people do just opt to, might as well just drive my own car if I can. And if the mass transit, isn't dependable. But some will argue that this expansion is necessary to reduce traffic congestion. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say, common sense dictates that unless you're widening the Holland Tunnel, you're just going to back up more and more cars on the Turnpike extension, because the Holland Tunnel is still the bottleneck. It was the bottleneck before, and it remains the bottleneck. You're basically taking all those lanes and going into 2 lanes. And it's the same thing now. That's not changing. So I get it, what they're going to convey, but it's not accurate if you just use your common sense.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about how this project, you're the mayor of Jersey City, how do you think this project could impact Jersey City specifically?
Well, look, I just want to say one of the things that we're saying is that the governor's own argument against New York's congestion pricing a month ago was he filed a lawsuit, and he said that it would impact communities in Bergen County predominantly with increased car traffic and increased pollution. At this stage, we're saying that same standard should apply to urban areas like Jersey City and Hoboken, because clearly you're increasing car traffic and increasing pollution. The same thing you said a month ago should apply here as well. We need some consistency. So from my standpoint, let's do a proper environmental impact study. Let's actually learn all the facts. Let's make an informed decision, because it's $11 billion, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. When it comes to public engagement, there's been criticism about of a lack of public engagement on the project. So what do you think, what steps can be taken to involve the community more?
I mean, look, more and more sessions that actually engage in a Q&A. I mean, these are more informational sessions where you have, Trenton talking at residents, explaining why this is important. And then, they released a video a couple days ago, basically highlighting, a promotional commercial on why this is necessary. I think the better approach and that people want is go to those neighborhoods and communities that are impacted and have an actual dialogue and a Q&A and open it up to real scrutiny. And I think that if you did that, you would find that, of course, everybody's supportive of repairs to the turnpike, making sure the bridges are safe, making sure that people can travel in an efficient way. But let's use the dollars in a better way to help everybody across the state.
Yeah. But people, they want to be heard. People understand that there is congestion.
Yeah.
When you're stuck on New Jersey Transit, sometimes just communicate, right? And they want to be heard. Now you've
Look, I
talked
think
yeah,
that's
go ahead.
I think that's a big part of the issue, to be honest with you. I think that the way this project has come to be is it's a massive investment, if not one of the largest in New Jersey right now, $11 billion. And there's a lack of clarity on who's asking for this and why are we pushing it so aggressively when it doesn't solve the problems. I just want to go back. Initially, they said, well, look, it's going to solve the traffic problems. We pushed back on that. And then then they said, well, it's going to help the truck traffic to Bayonne, which is 14A. And we said, okay, that could be important, but why are we extending it beyond then? And my point on that is that every step of the way, they're creating reasons why they need to do this. And every one of those reasons has a serious gap in it. And so I think just a dialogue with the community and more clarity would get everybody to a better place.
Yeah, and there has been. I mean, the governor, when I was at his budget address, he admitted, yeah, we've kind of ignored transportation issues and New Jersey Transit. It's a mess right now.
I mean, it used to be in the 80s and 90s kind of a thing that New Jersey was proud of. I mean, we had a great transportation infrastructure. New Jersey Transit was reliable. And you've seen several governors just allow it to deteriorate. So, yeah, Governor Murphy bears responsibility on that for sure. It has not gotten better, and we need some focus on it. But taking $11 billion that could be used towards expansion of services and rehabilitating existing infrastructure is really not a wise thing to do. And so, like last week was an opportunity to express publicly the fact that there are better uses for this money and we should be exploring those. And I still think there's an opportunity for Governor Murphy to pivot. And I hope he does. And one other point, there was an op-ed the other day on NJ.com about from building trades and really saying how this would create thousands upon thousands of jobs. And I appreciate that. Job creation is an important responsibility, of course, for anybody in government. However, investing in mass transit would also create those jobs and probably more permanent jobs as well. And so I don't think we'd lose any of the opportunity around jobs by pivoting and investing more in mass transit.
Yeah, because you have talked about making New Jersey a mass transit model again. So how does opposing the expansion fit into that vision of making it a model?
Yeah, I would piggyback on that we are a corridor state. I mean, we're between Philly and New York, a lot of traffic here. And as population continues to expand, which you see every census, there's reasons to think that more and more car traffic is not something that we could tolerate. So how do you solve that? You're not going to limit people on their number of cars. I mean, you're not going to do that. So you got to encourage people to use alternate means. And the only way to encourage them is by having a reliable alternative. And that means that the government needs to make New Jersey Transit into something that's reliable, effective, clean, something that people want to use. And that's just not the case today. And $11 billion is an opportunity to pivot and change that entire conversation around what New Jersey Transit looks like today.
Yeah, 11 billion, close to 11 billion. That's a nice chunk of change for sure.
Yeah. I think even those people in South Jersey that are so far from this turnpike expansion that have been asking for resources for the expansion of light rail down in South Jersey. I mean, this is an opportunity to solve that. The money is allocated towards transit. This is an opportunity to build that. So they should be in unison with us.
Yeah, so the protest you joined, it was very vocal. Do you think the level of public opposition could stop or at least significantly alter the project?
I mean, look, the governor seems like he's dug in support of it, which I think is a mistake. I think the point that we're trying to make at this time is just more studies, more environmental impact awareness. Let's get all the facts on the table, and then we'll address it from there. And they seem, bent on moving it as quickly as possible and avoiding that process. So I think the dialogue right now is about how do we get a proper environmental impact study, and what does that do once we have the information?
Yeah, and following up on that, you talked about wanting to make sure people are treated like adults when it comes to policy
Yeah.
discussion. So, how are you applying that approach to the turnpike issue?
I mean, look, I think from our campaign and as mayor, I try to treat people the way I want to be treated. I give them facts, even when it's not something that they would necessarily be supportive of. I tell them clearly this is the reason why we're doing it. And I think that the governor would be served to do the same. You know, it feels today like there's a lot of different agendas that have been pushing this for some time and not a lot of clarity on why and who. Now, that may happen in Trenton a lot, unfortunately, but when you're looking at a project that's $11 billion with a B, there really deserves a different level of scrutiny, making sure that dollars are being spent responsibly.
Yeah, so you're talking about light rail, talking about investing in New Jersey Transit. So if you were to actually propose an alternative to this expansion, what would it look like, and what would you ask the Turnpike Authority to do?
It would be taking the dollars that we need to rehabilitate the extension so it's safe. So that's repairing it, making sure that we have a life of that for another 50 years, and then taking the balance of the money and repairing train stations all throughout New Jersey, building out the Hudson-Bergen light rail into Bergen County, building out the South Jersey light rail corridor, making sure that infrastructure there is an operation, thinking about service to the northwestern portion of New Jersey that could use better transit service, modernizing our buses and bringing those in-house. All of those things could be done with $11 billion and still have money to spare. So what we're saying is it's an astronomical amount of money. You're just talking about, silly, stupid, huge money. And we're talking about pivoting that in a different direction so that way it better serves all of the people that live here.
Do you have a sense, or can you give the viewers a sense of timelines on this? You're talking about how this seems like it is being forced really quickly. Get this
Yeah,
through.
I mean, look,
Yeah,
it's moving. It's definitely moving very, very fast. And the conversation last week was about, hey, let's have the Coast Guard do a proper study, environmental impact. Let's see what's going to happen. And the state doesn't seem willing to kind of go through all of those steps. So they're looking to move it as quickly as possible to the point where you can never pivot or change direction. So that's really the focus ultimately right now. It's really, should we get all the information and do a proper study and then have a conversation from there versus let's get moving. We've done a couple check the box sort of community meetings and let's move on.
Mayor Stephen Fulop, Jersey City Mayor, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us on
Hey,
this
thank
issue.
you so much. It's great to be here.
Underage victims of domestic and sexual violence, their voices aren't always heard, and many of these young victims are being prosecuted. There is an organization looking to break the cycle of institutional abuse. Joining me now is Yasmin Vafa, head of Rights for Girls. Yasmin, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, can you first tell us a little bit about Rights for Girls and what inspired you to be the co-founder of this organization?
Well, Rights for Girls was started to focus on the lives of marginalized young women and girls here in the United States. When we first started the organization, we were really frustrated by the fact that so many girls here in the United States were experiencing violence, exploitation, human trafficking, the juvenile justice system, and there were really no spaces where these girls could be safe and could be themselves. And so many of the issues that they were experiencing were generational, but in none of the various spaces in which we were advocating were they actually talking about the unique and distinct experiences of girls. And so we really wanted to start an organization to really intentionally focus on the experiences of young women and girls here in the United States with a human rights lens, and to really elevate their voices, their experiences, so that girls' rights weren't just contemplated, but centered in all of the policy and advocacy spaces in which we operated.
Yeah. And some people might think, well, if you're a victim of sexual abuse, sexual violence, trafficking, report it. It should be easy enough. But it really isn't that easy. Can you tell us about the cycle that your organization has done a lot of research on, and you've pinned it, you've called it the sex abuse to prison pipeline?
Exactly. I mean, unfortunately, what we began to realize in the course of our work with talking to young women and girls all across the country, especially girls who were from impoverished communities, girls who had experienced multiple forms of adversity, girls who experienced disabilities, racism, sexism, and other challenges, when they experienced experiences of abuse, neglect, and family instability, when they had the experiences of abuse, they would often be forced to fend for themselves. And so the very common coping mechanisms that many children would exemplify would too often be punished, and in the worst cases be criminalized. And so what we started to really decipher from talking to young girls all across the country was that their experiences, for example, of running away, truancy, all of these behaviors that were actually coping mechanisms for the underlying trauma that they experienced were actually being criminalized. And so when we took these very high percentages of abuse that we were seeing across multiple juvenile justice systems across the country, in some cases, they were upwards of 80% of girls behind bars reporting past histories of sexual abuse and physical abuse. In some states, it was upwards of, even 90% of girls behind bars reporting having past experiences of abuse and sexual abuse in those cases.
Yeah.
When we looked at those high rates of trauma together with the most common offenses for girls, it became very clear that they were actually being punished for the abuse that they experienced. So the most common offenses for girls were things like running away from home, truancy, prostitution offenses, even though, we say there's no such thing as a child prostitute. These kids weren't even old enough to be consenting to sex, let alone commercial sex. And they were still being criminalized for it. So we began to see these patterns all across the country and realized that, unfortunately, it wasn't just a few bad jurisdictions. This was a national trend. And so we published this report in 2015 to really give a name to this troubling trajectory. And then just recently, we put out an update to the report that found not only is it still occurring, but in fact, girls are being pushed into the adult criminal justice system for some of the more egregious forms of violence that they're experiencing, things that really amount to acts of self-defense and attempts to escape their abusers.
And that's kind of where I was going. A lot of these girls are just trying to survive, and given another person in another circumstance with enough money and enough resources, that's going to be the victim. They're going to get, their day, but these young girls are surviving and being punished, which under the circumstances, of course you're going to run away. Of course you're going to act out. You're being harmed in the most personal way that you can. So how does Rights for Girls address the challenges faced by these young girls and these women who are being pushed off into the juvenile justice system for surviving?
Exactly. And oftentimes these are our most vulnerable children. Oftentimes we're talking about foster kids. We're talking about kids who've experienced egregious, child abuse. And so what we do is we educate, we train judges, for example. We have a partnership with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, where together we have launched a National Judicial Institute. We have trained, close to 1,000 judges nationwide on how to identify these children in their courtrooms, how to have the tools to reach these children and improve outcomes for them in a way that doesn't rely on detention and punitive measures, how to really, reach these children and look behind the charge. Instead of, punishing them for running away, why not ask, what were you running from? And really try to get at the root cause of what is causing this behavior, and hopefully be able to identify perpetrators and connect these children with healing and restorative services.
Yeah, being able to identify and get to that root cause of what has caused this behavior. Can you talk about some of the misconceptions about girls and young women who have experienced this type of exploitation, and how you're trying to inform law enforcement, judges, people in as part of the system who they might be trying to go to for help, but they don't know what they don't know?
Absolutely. I mean, in a lot of jurisdictions, people often think that these are, chronic runaways. In DC, for example, there was a period of time where people were talking about the missing girls, DC's missing girls. And, law enforcement came forward and said, don't worry, these are just chronic runaways. Well, that begs a number of questions. Why are these girls running away? Why are teenage girls chronically running away? Well, typically when young girls are running from home or running from a foster care placement, they're running from some type of typically a trauma, or they're running to get their needs met. And so again, we really encourage people to be asking these questions. Why are they running, instead of punishing the behavior without asking these important questions? Oftentimes, because of who these girls are, again, they often have a history of system involvement, foster care, child welfare system. Sometimes these are girls who, again, come from challenges and adversity. Immigrant youth, girls of color, girls with disabilities. And so, we often treat them and punish them as bad girls, instead of, again, trying to get to the root cause of the behavior and understand what's actually happening. And when we ask the right questions, we often realize that there's underlying trauma, and it presents a really critical intervention opportunity to provide services and support. And what we have found is when we do that, these girls go on to really lead really meaningful and important lives. Many of these young survivors have gone on to do amazing things, given the right resources and support.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear some of the success stories. First, I want to get to these girls who are being unfairly labeled, really, is what's happening. Given the circumstances, they're being labeled as a problem or an issue. How is your organization working to change the practices that is criminalizing the victims of sex abuse and trafficking? They show up as a runaway. They show up as, somebody who attacked somebody. Well, again, they're trying to survive. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So we have worked to pass a number of different laws across the states and as well as the federal level to help shift these perceptions as well as to shift the law. So we have worked in a number of jurisdictions to pass laws that recognize these child sex crime victims as in need of what we call survivor sentencing reform. And so many of these child sex trafficking victims and child sex crime victims are often charged as adults when they are accused of harming their adult abusers, often in acts of self-defense, often in attempts to escape their adult abusers or exploiters. Many of these cases have come to, the public attention. If you think of cases like Centoya Brown Long or Crystal Kaiser, Piper Lewis, many of these cases have come and received national attention of these children who, many of them were child sex trafficking victims who were being exploited for a number of years, and in, desperate attempts to either escape or protect themselves, acted out in violence against their adult exploiters. And so in these cases, often these young girls of color are labeled, bad girls, violent, offenders, and are charged and often sentenced to decades, if not life, behind bars. And so we've passed a number of bills across the states to allow judges to employ trauma-informed sentencing. And so in these cases, judges can depart from mandatory minimums and other sentencing guidelines when there is clear evidence that the child sex crime victim has acted out in violence against their abuser.
I was just going to say, as we're kind of closing out this segment here, what resources are available to these young women here in New Jersey and across the country to help them get out of this cycle? Because they are, make no mistake what you're saying, they're victims, and they're being victimized again for simply surviving and for circumstances that they didn't ask to be a part of.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to note, every state has really important resources for sexual assault survivors, rape crisis centers, child advocacy centers. So depending on the age of the young victim, there'll be, different resources available. But I think it's important to survey the different types of services that each state has, whether they're, a child sex trafficking victim, a victim of child abuse, family violence, to the extent that specialized services can be found and made available. I think that is going to be critical. But the most important thing is to really understand the underlying causes of the behavior at issue and to screen, across systems. One of the most important things is to be screening these youth, whether they're coming into contact with the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system, in schools, and to make sure that we are identifying children who have suffered abuse, neglect, sex trafficking, and make sure that we are identifying the abuse and getting these children into appropriate services, immediately and identifying that abuse and trauma.
Instead of saying, hey, what did they do? You ask, what happened to them that got them in this position? Yasmin Vafa, thank you so much. Rights for Girls, for taking the time to talk to us and for your voice, for being an advocate for so many young women who need a voice. Thank you. And that will do it for today. I'm Laura Jones. Thanks so much for watching New Jersey Politics. We look forward to seeing you back here next time.